Anglo Saxon society, customs, practices, and life. This narrative is proudly brought to you by Polly Speaks For You. At Polly Speaks For You, we are committed to empowering individuals, especially those with disabilities or learning challenges, through innovative text-to-speech and voice recognition technology. Polly Speaks For You is more than just software. It's a tool for self-expression, connecting people with the world in meaningful ways. By blending the richness of history with cutting-edge technology, Polly Speaks For You demonstrates that every voice, whether preserving the past or shaping the future, has the potential to inspire. While we strive to make the story engaging, our primary focus is on storytelling itself. The visuals are secondary. We're showcasing the remarkable capabilities of text-to-speech software that bring these stories to life. The Anglo Saxon period in England, spanning from the 5th to the 11th century, was a time of significant transformation and cultural enrichment. The Anglo Saxons, a group of tribes from what are now Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands, were pivotal in shaping the early foundations of England as we know it today. Their society, customs, and traditions reflect a blend of ancient Germanic practices and, over time, Christian influences. Below is a deeper exploration into their ways of life. 1. Social structure and hierarchy. Anglo-Saxon society was deeply stratified, and its hierarchical structure was integral to its functioning. The roles and privileges of individuals were largely determined by their position in the social ladder. The king. At the top of Anglo-Saxon society was the king, a leader with both political and religious power. Kings such as Alfred the Great and Athelstan were not just rulers, but also protectors of their people. Their power came from the divine right to rule, reinforced by Christian teachings. The king was responsible for protecting the kingdom from external threats, such as Viking invasions, and ensuring justice within his borders. He would rule from a hearth or hall, where he would hold court, dispense justice, and receive counsel. The nobles. Below the king were the earls or nobles, who controlled large territories. They were the landowners who helped enforce the king's will within their domains. In return for their loyalty, the king granted them land and wealth. Thanes, who were similar to lesser nobles or warriors, played a crucial role in this structure. Thanes swore allegiance to their earls and, in exchange, received land and the ability to accumulate wealth through agriculture and the labor of their peasants. Ceorls freemen. The ceorls formed the backbone of Anglo-Saxon society. As free men, they could own land and engage in trades such as farming, crafting, and herding. Though not as wealthy or powerful as the nobles, ceorls had certain rights, including the ability to engage in legal disputes and serve as members of the local militia. They were expected to contribute to the FYRD, the Anglo-Saxon military system. Thralls, slaves. At the bottom of the social ladder were the thralls, slaves who performed the bulk of the labor. Some thralls were prisoners of war, while others had been born into slavery. The status of a thrall was fixed, and they could be bought, sold, or inherited. Despite their lowly position, thralls were vital to Anglo-Saxon society, particularly in agricultural labor. 2. Laws and legal system. The Anglo-Saxons developed a system of laws designed to maintain order and resolve disputes. While much of this law was oral in nature, later kings such as King Alfred the Great codified laws in written form. Anglo-Saxon law revolved around the concepts of reparation, justice, and protection. Wergild man price. A key aspect of the Anglo-Saxon legal system was wergild, which involved compensating the family of a person who had been wronged or killed. The wergild system ensured that individuals had the financial means to seek justice without resorting to blood feuds. The value of a person's wergild was determined by their status in society, with kings, nobles, and warriors having higher wergild values than commoners. Trial by ordeal. When disputes could not be settled through compensation or negotiation, the Anglo-Saxons sometimes turned to trial by ordeal, a practice rooted in both divine law and superstition. These trials were believed to allow divine judgment to reveal the truth. One common form of trial by ordeal was trial by fire, in which an accused person would have to walk barefoot across a bed of hot coals. If they were unharmed, they were considered innocent, Other trials involved submerging the accused in water or having them carry a hot iron. The tithings and hundreds. Anglo-Saxon England was divided into local units known as tithings, groups of 10 households. Each tithing was responsible for ensuring that its members obeyed the law. The system was expanded to hundreds, which represented larger areas of land. This decentralized system of law and order helped maintain peace and enforce the king's laws across the kingdom. 3. Religion and beliefs. Religion in Anglo-Saxon England was dynamic, transitioning from paganism to Christianity over several centuries. Initially, Anglo-Saxons followed the polytheistic religion of their Germanic ancestors, worshipping a variety of gods associated with nature, war, and fertility. Paganism. Before the arrival of Christianity, the Anglo-Saxons followed Germanic paganism, which involved worshipping gods such as Woden, the god of wisdom and war, Thunor, the god of thunder, and Frigg, the goddess of marriage and motherhood. These gods were honored through sacrifices, feasts, and festivals. The sacred oak tree was a central element of pagan worship, and many Anglo-Saxons believed that certain natural sites, such as hills, groves, and rivers, were imbued with divine power. Christianity. Christianity was introduced to the Anglo-Saxons through missionaries, with St. Augustine of Canterbury being one of the most notable figures in this process. In 597 AD, Pope Gregory the Great sent Augustine to England to convert the Anglo-Saxons. By the 8th century, the majority of the Anglo-Saxon elite had converted to Christianity, and monasteries began to flourish. Christianity brought with it not only a new spiritual focus, but also new customs, including the building of churches and the celebration of Christian festivals like Easter and Christmas. Monasteries and churches became centers of learning, culture, and literacy in Anglo-Saxon England. They were not only places of religious devotion, but also hubs of intellectual activity. Monks and nuns copied and preserved classical texts, wrote down historical records, and produced religious manuscripts. The church played an essential role in everyday life, with clergy officiating at weddings, baptisms, and burials. Monasteries also provided a safe haven for travelers and the poor. 4. Daily life and work. The majority of Anglo-Saxons were farmers, and their lives were governed by the rhythms of the seasons. Much of their agricultural work focused on growing cereals like barley, wheat, and rye, and raising livestock such as cattle, sheep, and pigs. Agriculture and farming. The Anglo-Saxon economy was heavily dependent on agriculture. Fields were tilled using simple tools such as plows, hoes, and sickles. Most farmers worked in open field systems, where land was divided into strips and each family had access to a share of the land for cultivation. Crop rotation was a common practice to ensure that the soil remained fertile. In addition to crops, the Anglo-Saxons also raised livestock such as sheep for wool and cattle for meat and milk. Craftsmanship and trade. Apart from farming, craftsmanship was an essential aspect of Anglo-Saxon life. Metalworking, wood carving, weaving, and pottery were common trades. Blacksmiths created tools, weapons, and jewelry, while textile workers spun wool and wove it into clothing. Trade was also important, and Anglo-Saxon merchants traded goods with neighboring regions, including Scandinavia, France, and Ireland. Trading hubs like London and Winchester grew in prominence, facilitating the exchange of goods like wool, furs, and metals. Household and family life. In the home, Anglo-Saxons lived in small wattle and daub houses with thatched roofs. These homes had simple furnishings, including wooden chairs, tables, and chests for storage. The hearth at the center of the home provided warmth, light, and a place for cooking. Families were the cornerstone of Anglo-Saxon society, with children helping with chores from a young age. Women's roles were primarily focused on managing the household, raising children, and performing domestic duties such as cooking, spinning wool, and weaving cloth. 5. Arts, literature, and culture. The Anglo-Saxons had a rich artistic tradition that was influenced by both their pagan roots and the Christianization of their culture. They were skilled in a variety of crafts, from metalworking to illuminated manuscripts, and their literary heritage has left a lasting legacy. Art and craftsmanship. Anglo Saxon metalwork is among the most exquisite of the period. Artifacts such as the Sutton Hoo helmet, golden brooches, and finely crafted swords reflect the skill and sophistication of Anglo Saxon artisans. These objects were not only functional, but also highly decorative, showcasing intricate patterns and motifs, often with symbolic meanings. Literature. The Anglo-Saxons are perhaps best known for their epic literature, including the legendary poem Beowulf. This epic, written in Old English, tells the story of a heroic warrior battling monsters and dragons. It reflects themes of bravery, honor, and fate. Other works of Anglo-Saxon literature include religious texts and historical chronicles. Caedmon's Hymn, a Christian poem attributed to the first Anglo-Saxon poet Caedmon, is an early example of the integration of Christian themes into the literary tradition. Illuminated manuscripts. Monasteries were the centers of intellectual activity, and monks produced beautifully illuminated manuscripts. These manuscripts were adorned with intricate designs, often incorporating both Christian iconography and traditional Anglo-Saxon artistic styles. The Lindisfarne Gospels and Codex Amiatinus are among the most famous examples of Anglo-Saxon manuscript art. 6. Warfare and military culture. The Anglo-Saxons had a rich warrior culture, which was defined by loyalty, valor, and martial prowess. Their military system was structured around the FYRD, a militia made up of free men who were obligated to fight for their king. The FYRD. The FYRD was the backbone of Anglo-Saxon military power. It was a system that required freemen to serve in the army during times of war. The FYRD was a local militia, often organized by regions or groups of landholders, and its soldiers were expected to provide their own weapons, armor, and food for campaigns. The role of the warrior. The Anglo-Saxon warrior was not only a soldier, but also a symbol of honor and loyalty. Loyalty to one's lord was paramount, and warriors were often rewarded with land or treasures for their service. Heroic poetry celebrated the deeds of great warriors, and the famous lines of Beowulf embody the Anglo-Saxon ideal of courage and strength. Viking invasions. The Viking invasions of the 9th and 10th centuries were a defining challenge for the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Vikings, skilled in seafaring and raiding, launched devastating attacks on monasteries and towns, and their raids led to the eventual establishment of the Danelaw in parts of England. 7. Burial customs and practices in Anglo-Saxon England. Burial customs in Anglo-Saxon England were influenced by both pagan traditions and Christian beliefs as the period progressed. Initially, Anglo-Saxons followed pagan burial practices, which involved elaborate rituals and a deep belief in an afterlife. However, as Christianity spread through England, these practices gradually evolved to reflect Christian teachings about life after death and the resurrection. Pagan burial practices. Before the widespread adoption of Christianity, Anglo-Saxons believed in an afterlife where the soul continued to exist in a realm similar to the one they inhabited on earth. Pagan burials were thus seen as a means to ensure the deceased had a smooth transition to the afterlife. 1. Ship burials. One of the most iconic forms of Anglo-Saxon pagan burials was the ship burial, particularly for high-ranking individuals. This type of burial was often used for kings, nobles, and warriors who had earned great honor during their lives. The body of the deceased was placed in a boat or ship, along with weapons, tools, jewelry, and sometimes slaves or other individuals to accompany them in the afterlife. The ship burial was symbolic, reflecting the idea of the deceased traveling to the afterlife across water, often represented as a journey to the other world. One of the most famous examples of a ship burial is found at Sutton Hoo, where the remains of an Anglo-Saxon king were discovered, along with a wealth of grave goods, including a ceremonial helmet, shield, and sword. 2. Cremation and burial mounds. In the early Anglo-Saxon period, cremation was a common burial practice. The deceased's body was burned, and the ashes were placed in a ceramic urn or buried in a mound, known as a barrow. These mounds served as markers for the grave, often built in prominent locations such as hilltops or along important trade routes. The belief in cremation was tied to the idea that the fire purified the spirit of the deceased, ensuring their safe passage to the next world. 3. Grave goods. Anglo Saxon burial sites often contained a variety of grave goods, which were items buried alongside the deceased to accompany them into the afterlife. These could include weapons, tools, jewelry, pottery, and personal items. Grave goods reflected the status of the deceased, with high-ranking individuals being buried with more elaborate and expensive items. For example, a warrior might be buried with his sword, shield, and armor, while a woman might have items such as jewelry, textiles, and spinning tools. These items were believed to help the deceased in their journey or to serve them in the afterlife. Christian influence on burial practices. As Christianity spread through Anglo-Saxon England, burial practices began to change, with a shift toward Christian rituals and a new understanding of life after death. By the 7th century, Christian burial practices became more common, and pagan traditions gradually faded. 1. Christian burial customs. Christian burials were typically simpler than the elaborate pagan rituals that had come before. The focus shifted from offering grave goods to providing a proper burial for the soul's peaceful rest. Churchyards became the primary burial places, with bodies often interred in the ground without the inclusion of grave goods. Christian burials were generally marked by a simple headstone or cross that symbolized the individual's faith in the resurrection. 2. The role of churchyards. Christian burials were often conducted near churches, reflecting the belief in the sanctity of the Christian community and the hope for eternal life through Christ. Monasteries and churches became the focal point of Christian rituals, and many Anglo-Saxon saints were honored with special places of burial. Over time, churchyards became the primary burial grounds, and priests would officiate at the burial ceremonies, reciting prayers for the deceased soul. 3. The influence of monasticism. Monasteries played an important role in shaping Christian burial practices. Saints, bishops, and monks were often buried within the monastery grounds. Monasteries were seen as sacred spaces, and burial near a holy site was believed to ensure the deceased soul would find favor with God. For example, the Benedictine monks were responsible for overseeing burials and prayers for the dead. The early Anglo-Saxon Christian practice of praying for the souls of the deceased and memorial services became an integral part of the burial customs. 4. Shift from cremation to inhumation. The Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England led to a decline in the practice of cremation. Inhumation, or the burial of the body intact, became the preferred method of disposal for the dead. Christians believed that the body should be treated with respect, as it would eventually be resurrected at the Last Judgment. The burial of the whole body symbolized the Christian belief in the resurrection of the flesh. Anglo-Saxon burial rituals and funerary practices. 1. Wake and funeral feasts. Funeral rites were a significant part of Anglo-Saxon burial customs, both in pagan and Christian traditions. The deceased family would hold a wake, which was a period of mourning that often lasted several days. During this time, the body would be prepared for burial, and feasts were held to honor the deceased. These feasts were sometimes accompanied by ritual drinking and song, particularly in the pagan tradition. Lamentations and eulogies were also important elements of funeral ceremonies, with close family and friends sharing stories of the deceased's life and deeds. 2. Burial ceremony. The burial ceremony was an important and highly ritualized event. The body would typically be placed on a bier or a bed, and then transported to the burial site. The Christian burial service would include prayers and psalms, and the body would be lowered into the grave with a blessing. Over time, Christian rituals became more standardized, and the priest would preside over the ceremony, offering prayers for the soul's journey to heaven. 3. The role of the family members played a crucial role in the burial process, as the deceased kin were responsible for preparing the body, arranging the funeral, and ensuring that the proper rituals were followed. In both pagan and Christian traditions, it was the family's duty to honor the deceased and ensure that their soul would find peace in the afterlife. Conclusion. The burial customs and practices of the Anglo-Saxons reveal much about their beliefs, values, and attitudes toward life and death. In the early centuries, pagan rituals focused on elaborate ceremonies and grave goods, reflecting a belief in the continuation of life after death. As Christianity spread, these practices shifted towards simpler, more spiritual rituals focused on prayer and faith in the resurrection. Regardless of the changing religious landscape, the Anglo Saxons maintained a strong reverence for their ancestors and believed in the importance of ensuring a proper burial to safeguard the soul's journey to the afterlife. Anglo Saxon burial sites, whether they are ship burials, barrows, or Christian churchyards, provide us with invaluable insights into their rich cultural and religious heritage. These practices offer a glimpse into how the Anglo Saxons understood death, the afterlife, and the spiritual connection between the living and the dead. If you're enjoying this story, please remember to hit like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us continue creating content that educates and empowers. To learn more about South Africa's leading accessibility software and to support our dyslexic-friendly initiative, visit www.polispeaks4u.co.za. Drop a comment if you want more information. Thank you for watching this video.